Okay, so today we are going through, some practice questions for basically developing our skills of how to answer data analysis, kind of case studies, linking back to dimensions of health and well-being. Those kinds of questions. So what we're doing today is I'm going to be showing you guys some questions, and I want you guys to basically answer these questions within the time limit. Do try to do it within the time limit, because this is the time limit that we try to apply at a VCE level. Okay, so I'm just going to put 5 minutes on my timer, and when I say start writing, you can start looking at this question. Now you can see that this is a data analysis question, which means that you have to look at this data, look at all the components that I told you guys, that I always tell you guys about in the checklist, and just essentially compare. Okay, and read the question properly, see how many marks it's worth, and write your response. And I'm going to put 5 minutes on the clock, and your time starts now. Okay, so hopefully you had enough time to answer this question. So we're just looking at this graph here, and this graph is showing us the proportion. Proportion means percentage. So whenever you see the word proportion in a data analysis, just remember that it means the percentage, okay? So the percentage of children who are bullied during the school year by frequency of bullying. And frequency of bullying is on our x-axis here. So almost never, then we got monthly, then we got weekly. And the two graphs here are the darker blue one is like the year 4 students, and the lighter blue is the year 8 students. And the graph was obviously published in 2015. So those are the main things that we're looking at when we're looking at this graph and trying to identify the different components. So just looking at the sample answer now, it should have all of those components that we always discuss. So I'm just going to show you guys the sample answer. So in 2015, so that's number one, your year. It doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be at the very beginning of your answer, but it does have to be somewhere in your answer. So I usually put it at the beginning so I can get it out of the way. In 2015, that's 1 mark. There was a significantly higher proportion or percentage. So that's me describing the data, providing some kind of a direction of the trend. So that's 1 mark again. Proportion, and then I quote the number, which is again another 1 mark, because I've read the numerical data from the graph. So I'm looking at these two here. Okay, I'm just looking at this part of the graph for my answer. Of year 4 students who were bullied on a weekly basis, compared to year 8 students, where only about 10% approximately of year 8 students had been bullied. Simple as that. Just 1 mark for the year, 1 mark for the descriptive wording of significantly higher, lower, whatever. 1 mark for mentioning the numerical data for the year 4 students, 1 mark for mentioning the numerical data for the year 8 students. So it's as simple as that. It's just basically going through our checklist. Remember, I gave you guys that checklist of components when we do data analysis questions, and essentially that's all you really have to do. Okay, a question, if it's worth 4 marks, don't you need to say like a reason? For example, when you're older, you're more mature. Yep, that's a really good reason, but I haven't asked you guys to provide a justification for the data. If I asked you to justify a reason for the trend, then you would have to include that part that you could say, oh, year 8s are more older, so there's less bullying that happens maybe. But in this case, you don't have to provide a reason. So unless they explicitly ask you to provide a reason or a justification, you don't have to. So in this case, the question didn't ask you to do that. Alrighty, so just a few tips here. Number 1, you must include the numerical data for this question because it is worth more than 1 mark. Remember, we said if a data analysis question is worth more than 1 mark, you always have to include the actual percentages or the actual numbers on the y-axis, whether that's percentages, whether we're talking about life expectancy in years, anything, okay, any numerical data. And yeah, if you follow the checklist of data analysis question components, so talking about the year, all those things that we've just discussed, you should be able to do this question quite easily. And it should be an easy 4 marks. Alrighty, going on to the next question, if no one has any other questions about this one. So this is still related to bullying. So it's still a part of the data analysis question, but obviously this is more about the explanation now. So you're not going to actually analyze data for this question. You're simply going to link to 2 dimensions of health and well-being. And the question is, outline the impact of a child getting frequently bullied on any 2 dimensions of their health and well-being. So we're giving you an option here. You can choose any 2 dimensions of health and well-being and explain how getting frequently bullied as a child would impact those 2 dimensions of health and well-being. So I'm going to put 5 minutes on the clock now, and your time starts now. Yep, so this question just looks at what is the impact of a child that's getting frequently bullied on any two dimensions of their health and well-being. So in your answer, you are expected to clearly indicate which dimension of health and well-being you're referring to, as well as how you relate that back to a child who's getting frequently bullied. So I'm just going to go ahead and show you guys the sample response. So I've just written, a child who is frequently bullied will most likely have low self-esteem because they're constantly being put down by the bully, which would lead to decrease or decline in their mental dimension of health and well-being. So that's 2 marks already. And the 2 marks, I'll just show you how we get the 2 marks. The first one is for you actually just writing down one of the dimensions of health and well-being correctly. And the other one is for linking it to the actual bullying. So low self-esteem because the bully is putting them down, making them feel bad about themselves. So that's 2 marks. Just up to there. The other 2 marks of the question come from you, again, doing the same thing for another dimension of health and well-being. So furthermore, a child who's bullied may feel socially excluded or isolated from others, which could decrease their social dimension of health and well-being. And you see that I've just used the abbreviation here. And this is something that you can do in your answers as well. Rather than writing health and well-being every time, you write it fully the first time, and then you use the abbreviation the first time. And then thereafter, you don't have to use the full word. You can just use the abbreviation. As long as you write the full word the first time in your answer, afterwards you can just keep using the abbreviation from there. Okay, so 1 mark for identifying each dimension of health and well-being. So social and mental is what I've done, but you could have chosen any of the others. And 1 mark for linking to the concept of the impact of bullying in general.
Can low self-esteem and confidence be like for social health and well-being as well?
Sorry, I missed the first part of what you said.
Like low self-esteem and confidence, can it like link to social health and well-being?
No, not really.
When they're being excluded, right? This
Yeah.
affects the ability to like be confident in like a teamwork, or I don't know.
Yeah, if you wanted to explain it like that, you could first talk about social well-being, and then you could say, as a result of this, the child may feel less confidence or have lower self-esteem, which affects their mental health and well-being. So as long as you're linking each one to the correct dimension of health and well-being, it doesn't matter what order you do it in, it's still fine.
Okay.
Yeah. Alrighty. So yeah, this is again, this question is testing your knowledge of the dimensions of health and well-being, which we use that abbreviation PMES to remember. Now be very careful, don't confuse yourself between the dimensions of health and well-being and the areas of development, okay? Even though in the areas of development, we've got similar words like physical development, physical health and well-being, etc. You have to be careful to remember that the dimensions of health and well-being are different from the areas of development. So it's physical, mental dimension, emotional dimension, social dimension, and spiritual dimension. So if you've mentioned anything in your answer that isn't, that doesn't come under these 5, then that would be incorrect, and you would lose a mark for not correctly identifying the specific dimension of health and well-being. Okay, but that's essentially like what you would write to get an answer there for the full 4 marks. Alrighty, so moving on. Another question relating to health and well-being. This is a case study. Now, this case study, you're just going to read through it, and I have given you a little bit extra time to account for the fact that you need to read through the case study. So outline the interrelationships between 3 dimensions of health and well-being. So remember, this question is asking about interrelationships. So you're not only separately talking about 3 dimensions of health and well-being, you're trying to connect them. Okay, so you're trying to connect them and talk about how one impact in one dimension could lead to another impact in another dimension, as best as you can. It doesn't have to be perfect connections or perfect links between, but at least some kind of a link should be there. Okay, and I'll just put 7 minutes on the clock. Where's my timer gone? Okay. Okay, so 7 minutes on the clock and your time starts now. So if we look at an answer for this response now, it's got to obviously name the 3 dimensions of health and well-being. Those are where the first 3 marks come from. The next 3 marks come from correctly and accurately relating it back to the scenario. So I'm just going to show you guys the sample response. So this is just one example of a sample response. Now it is worth 6 marks. So obviously you are expected to write for this response. You can't just write 2 or 3 words here. You will have to do a little bit of writing for this question. And again, the question command term is outline. So whenever you see the question command term being outline means to give an extended response. So Tom's broken arm has prevented him from attending training sessions and playing rugby. This could reduce flexibility in his muscles and joints. So that's my example, relating it back to the scenario. Decreasing which dimension? Well, decreasing his physical dimension of health and well-being. Okay, and again, you can see that I've just written the full form of the word health and well-being in my first part of the answer here, and I've written H and W, and thereafter or hereafter, I'm just going to refer to it as H and W. I'm not going to write health and well-being. So it's going to save me some time and make my life a little bit easier. Okay, intern. So again, whenever you're doing interrelationships questions, it's really important that you use linking words and use words that are connecting one topic to the next. So we call them linking words, and you would have done them in English as well. So words like in turn, consequently, as a result of, blah, blah, blah. All right, so in turn, his absence from the rugby games, which he's so enthusiastic about, has also meant that Tom feels upset. So I've just quoted that word from the scenario from here. Or you can even quote the word frustrated, it's up to you. And he's unable to control his emotions. Example, he snaps at his family, which reflects a decrease in his emotional dimension of health and well-being. So that's me not only saying that his emotional well-being is decreasing, but explaining how it is decreasing, relating back to the scenario. And furthermore, Tom's broken arm means that he can't attend his training and misses seeing his friends. And so this social isolation is ultimately leading to a decrease in Tom's social dimension of health and well-being. So again, all you're really doing is you're identifying the types of well-being that you're talking about, and then you're relating it back to the scenario. And with this question, because it says between 3 dimensions, and we haven't specified which ones you need to talk about, you can actually discuss any 3 that are easiest for you to remember. So for example, in this question, if you don't really have a good understanding of emotional dimension, you could talk about mental dimension of health and well-being. You could talk about how Tom is feeling stressed, or Tom is feeling anxious that he's missing the games, that he's not able to be with his team. Okay, you could talk about how his self-confidence is decreasing, because we talk about how he's losing his confidence. Okay, if you wanted to talk about spiritual health and well-being, you could have talked about the fact that Tom is losing this sense of hope for his future, that his arm is going to heal quickly. Okay, he might be losing that sense of belonging to a group, which is his rugby team, okay, who shares the same values as he does. So again, you could have linked to any of the dimensions here, and there are multiple ways in which you could have linked to each dimension. So this was a pretty accessible question or accessible case study. It's just about making sure that you are correctly relating whichever dimension you're talking about to the actual case study. Okay, so that would obviously get you the marks. And we always talk about signposting. Signposting is not just talking about that, oh, Tom feels upset, but then linking that directly to the fact that it's decreasing his emotional health and well-being. You can't just write that he feels upset, full stop, without explaining or identifying which dimension he's linking to, and so which dimension that is linking to. And so your ability to clearly identify the dimensions of health and well-being in your answer nice and clearly is what signposting is. You signpost which dimension is related to which example in your response, and that is the sign of a good response or an excellent high-level response there. Alrighty, so that is what our case study looks like. And I believe this is the last question we're doing for today. Whoops, sorry, my bad. Okay, yeah, so this is the last question we're doing for today. So again, the same case study, but now you're linking it to how it impacts his health status, okay? And it's worth 2 marks. So again, this is assessing your knowledge of chapter 2 and the health status indicators. So I'm gonna put 3 minutes on the clock now. Just give me 1 second. Okay, 3. Okay, and your time starts now. This question is looking at the same case study as the previous question, but it's linking to health status. Now, health status, whenever you see the word health status in a response, it basically means that you're linking it to one of the indicators, okay? The indicators that we learned about in chapter 2, okay? You would remember some of them like life expectancy, morbidity, mortality, incidence, prevalence, burden of disease, you know, self-assessed health status, core activity limitation. All of those things are examples of health status indicators. You can't just pick any of them though, and I'll explain why you can't just pick any of them. You've got to pick one that's relevant to Tom's situation. So I'm just going to go ahead and show you guys the answer first. So this is what I've just written. Tom's broken arm is an example of an injury that is subjecting him to some level of pain and suffering. For this reason, it is impacting Tom's health status by increasing the morbidity that he experiences. Remember, I always told you guys that morbidity is the best health status indicator, not the best health status indicator, but it's one that will fit for any situation, because everyone will experience some level of pain and suffering regardless of what illness or injury they have, but not everyone will suffer death as a result of that. So the reason I was saying that you can't just apply any health status indicator to this response is you can't say, for example, that it's impacting Tom's health status by increasing his mortality, because Tom hasn't actually died from his injury, from his broken arm. He's just suffering, but he's not actually died. It hasn't led to some kind of fatality. Okay, so that's why it's important to think about all the health status indicators and pick the one that is most relevant for Tom's situation. Now, morbidity is probably the most relevant one, but you can even talk about incidence. You can talk about prevalence. You could say that Tom's injury is actually contributing to the overall incidence or new cases of injuries among youth. Or you could talk about how Tom's injury is contributing to the overall total number of cases of injuries in youth, thus increasing the prevalence of injury across young people. So you could link it to any one of those. You can't really link it to things like life expectancy though, because Tom's broken arm probably won't affect his life expectancy so much as it would just affect his overall flexibility of muscles and joints. So yeah, those are some examples of health status indicators that you can use. Again, you get 1 mark for explaining how that broken arm is actually impacting his health status by talking about maybe pain or suffering, talking about how his physical functioning is affected, talking about how maybe it's a debilitating condition or it's disabling him or preventing him from doing his normal activities. And then 1 mark for linking it back to the actual health status indicator by just identifying that indicator in your actual answer. So I've just written by increasing the morbidity. That gives me the extra 1 mark there. So 1 + 1 equals 2, a total of 2 marks there. So hopefully you can start to, all of you are really good at linking to health and well-being now. And we've been doing that from the beginning of the year. But for the rest of the year, I'm really focused on you guys kind of trying to get a better understanding of how to link to health status, because this could use some more work in terms of how we actually link to health status. And I think that we do need to do more practice questions similar to this one, because next year you are going to have questions where you are linking to health and well-being, but you are also going to have questions where you are linking to health status. And so it's important for us to build up both of those skills equally and make sure that you guys are pretty good at doing this by the end of the year. Alrighty, so I think that brings us to the end. Yes, that brings us to the end of today. So I'll just stop the recording here.